Oh, qué pendejo, no me lo puedo quitar. Ok, miren, para los que no saben, los voy a poner en contexto. El día de hoy, hace un par de horas, salió un anuncio en el cual venía una funcionalidad nueva para la interfase base de WoW, en la cual van a meter la posibilidad de, con un solo botón, van a meter toda tu rotación en un solo botón. Con esto, lo que pretenden es que sea más sencillo para la gente poder acceder al contenido de endgame de WoW. La parte negativa de este sistema, porque no puede ser solamente positiva, porque igual todo el mundo lo usaría, es que el sistema le va a agregar tiempo al global cooldown, por lo cual no va a ser lo más efectivo, lo más eficaz para hacer, pero obviamente va a ayudar a un grueso de la población que simplemente no se preocupa por revisar cómo es la rotación, no se preocupa por revisar absolutamente nada de su clase y solamente se quiere meter, ver números grandotes, etc, etc. Ellos lo están poniendo más que nada como un tema de funcionalidad, pero vamos a ver el video hoy de todo lo que dicen de este tema y vamos a reaccionar precisamente a eso. Vamos a ver.
Welcome to a special edition of WowCast, where we're going to talk about a patch 11.1.7 feature, and then a broader discussion about add-ons in World of Warcraft in general. I'm Dratnos, World of Warcraft content creator.
I'm Max, I'm the raid leader of Team Liquid, the WoW Guild, and a content creator as well.
Oh!
I'm Ian Hasekostas, game director on WoW.
Pura gente casual, el rey líder de Liquid.
Oh, and it's a pleasure to be here with you guys.
Very excited to be here. So what are we doing in 11.1.7?
A whole bunch of fun stuff, but one of the features that we're extra excited about is a new UI option that we're adding called Rotation Assist, which is really designed to help players who are maybe picking up a new spec or want some guidance on what abilities they should be using when, without having to turn to third-party add-ons for it. So we've seen that, there's an add-on called Hekili that is very popular with a lot of players. We're basically building
algo muy importante de decir de esta funcionalidad es que ya existe con add-ons. Existe con Wicauras, existe con add-ons que literalmente te dicen qué botón presionar después. Entonces, esto no es nuevo, pero ahora va a estar dentro del juego. Eso es una distinción que tenemos que hacer porque mucha gente va a pensar de que, ya no, esto es algo totalmente... No, o sea, esto ya existe.
And a very similar version of that into the base UI that you can opt into. That will, no matter what DPS spec you're playing, highlight the recommended next ability given your current energy, what's going on around you, and so forth. One extra thing that we're also going to do,
y tampoco es perfecto, ¿eh? Tampoco es perfecto.
Which maybe goes a bit beyond what the add-ons can do, is also have a one-button version of that, where there'll be like a keybind that if you just want almost an auto-rotation, you can opt into that, and it will just automatically cast the next recommended ability in the sequence. There'll be a small GCD penalty associated with that, but we want to make sure that this is for accessibility purposes, that it's there for people who maybe just honestly aren't interested in the gameplay of like mastering their spec. They want to explore Azeroth and experience the story, and the mechanics kind of get in the way of that sometimes. This should be for...
Ok, pues básicamente es un tema interesante. Realmente creo que no va a terminar siendo para quien lo están pensando. Creo que la intención de Ion es para la gente que no le interesa cómo estar raideando o hacer contenido de PvE. Pero, honestamente, el grueso de la población de WoW no lee, no sabe, o sea, no lee nada de su clase, no sabe nada de su clase, no se preocupa por investigar el tema de las rotaciones y todo eso. Esa es una realidad. Ese es el jugador promedio. O sea, si agarráramos si lo representáramos en 100% del 50 para abajo, créanme que no se preocupan para nada de revisar. Entonces, creo que al final del día, para esas personas va a ser algo muy positivo. Ahora, también es muy importante que la penalización del global cooldown sea lo suficientemente alta para que no todo el mundo lo tenga aplicando, no todo el mundo esté utilizando este add-on. Pero al final del día creo que va a ser un beneficio en general para la gente, definitivamente.
Them. Ideally, this is not a tool where someone is like being told by their raid leader to stop trying to DPS manually and just turn on the one button mode to meet some DPS check. That we want to give you the tools to kind of go through that organic progression naturally.
Great. But so the rotation assist doesn't come with a penalty or anything like that. That's just we're going to show you what your next button is.
Exactly.
Right.
It's very similar to the Quiere add-on. It's kind of reflecting, just the latest kind of established theory crafting, and it's something that we would continue to update, with spec changes and class changes over time. Ideally, it all
No conozco literalmente ese add-on, el Quiere creo que se llama.
Idea that we've seen
Ese
a
no lo
valuable
conozco.
tool that players feel like they should be looking outside the game to download, and we'd rather just reduce the barriers to that and make it available to everyone.
Okay.
Pero igual, como les dije, si ya existe, pues ¿por qué no?
Yeah, because there's two parts of it, right? Like the advanced is, I want to really go into this, is the one button thing, but that's not necessarily everyone that's going to use this. Like, I think this game, especially new players getting into it, there's a lot going on within a particular class, and you can be a little lost trying to figure out exactly what I should be pressing. So even just using it as like a guide to start learning your class and move off of it eventually, but just having a base understanding of what actually should I be doing at a base level in this.
That's really exactly the...
Ese es un tema muy importante porque la primera funcionalidad, el hecho de que solamente te ponga como que te ponga más brillante la habilidad que puedes utilizar, eso creo que es lo mejor de este anuncio. El de un solo botón creo que ya es llevártelo al siguiente nivel, no creo que sea tan positivo, pero que te esté mostrando más o menos para dónde irte, creo que te ayuda mucho y te va a reducir muchísimo la entrada de nuevos jugadores, que creo que es el problema más grande que tiene WoW en este momento, que no es muy fácil que una persona nueva llegue, aprenda el juego y se ponga a jugarlo.
Motivation on our end. I mean, especially with warbands and War Within, we see lots and lots more alts, and leveling is pretty quick. You got a bunch of warbound until equipped gear that you're passing over to a new character, and just jumping into their full rotation. We've never played the spec seriously before, can be a pretty serious undertaking. And for some people, this may be enough for them, and that's fine too. But we recognize that there's so much. WoW has such a high skill ceiling that just recommending what the next ability isn't going to really remove that or fully solve that. There's still the muscle memory that.
En mi opinión, WoW no tiene un techo de ¿cómo dijo? Un techo de habilidad tan alto. Honestamente, creo que WoW es más que nada de leer. WoW no es tan complicado o tan difícil mecánicamente, pero entiendo su punto. En mi opinión, no es tan elevado el techo. Creo que leyendo la generalidad puedes parsear fácil entre 70, 80 hasta 90 sin ningún problema, pero sí entiendo su punto.
You need to form, and then all of the nuances of, like, we might have a recommendation for a rotation that makes sense if you're fighting a target dummy, you're fighting patchwork, but when you need to plan around the fact that you're going to have to move in 4 seconds, that's a whole different layer of skill that still rests with players.
Yeah, I know when I'm trying to, play a new spec for the first time or haven't played it in years, it often feels like I've got like a 30-minute checklist of, okay, I got to set up my keybinds, got to make sure, oh, this ability's changed since 2 expansions ago, I got to...
Pero esa es la naturaleza de WoW, eso no lo vas a poder cambiar. O sea, literalmente, una de las cosas que es muy diferentes que tiene WoW a otros géneros, que tienen los MMOs en general, es el hecho de que cada uno de los specs se tiene que jugar diferente, porque tienen que tener identidad. Si no, o sea, no hay una manera de que un MMO, eso no lo vayas a tener que cambiar. No vayas a tener que cambiar tus keybinds porque las habilidades son diferentes, porque los cooldowns son diferentes, etc. Porque regresamos al problema que ha sido algo de lo más criticado a través de los años por la comunidad de WoW, que es la homogenización de las clases, que nadie al final del día, aparentemente, nadie es lo que quiere eso, ¿no? Nadie quiere que todas las clases sean exactamente iguales. Entonces, ese problema no lo van a poder arreglar. Independientemente de que tengan este add-on o no. Entrar a una clase nueva tiene un momento de preparación, tiene un momento de entendimiento y no hay manera de poder esquivar eso.
Rebind that, and then I got to go and read some guides and figure out how all my new rotation works.
Correcto.
And, here's how the new set bonus works. So
Correcto.
I could see it being really nice to just have this is a way to jump into some content to do with your friends and have it work out nice and easily. One thing that
Sí,
jumps out to me is
de
that
manera
a lot
más
of the
casual está
content
bien.
I'd want to do would be like delves or keys. And in either of those cases, there's a lot of AoE.
Yeah.
Is this going to have are we going to detect whether we're fighting 3 targets, 5 targets, and is it going to cast my Arcane Explosion instead of my Arcane Blast, or is it just always going to be a single target?
Esa
It's not just
es
single
una buena
targets.
pregunta.
There is, some sense of, how many enemies are within your range, in front of you, etc. And so that will affect the recommendations. Again, the goal is not optimal. The goal is not like this is going to,
Claro.
everyone's always going to get perfect parses and so forth going forward. But as a baseline, this should be, it should be useful the same way that many, many people find Hakili.
Es más que nada para que tengas la idea de cómo funciona el spec. Y eso me parece una buena decisión.
Really useful today. And really, like a lot of this building on the foundations of the cooldown manager that just came out in 11.1.5 kind of reflects us hearing people in the community telling us that they feel like they need to seek out these third-party resources just to play the game at like a baseline effective level in competitive content. And us asking, like, is that where we want the game to be in the long term, and what can we do to build in native solutions to many of these problems?
En mi opinión, el problema más grande que tiene un jugador nuevo no es nada más el tema de la rotación, sino el tema de qué hacer una vez que llegas a máximo nivel y cómo llegar a máximo nivel. Y creo, en mi opinión, que la experiencia que te ofrece el cliente de WoW, es decir, el juego, dentro del juego, está muy limitada a explicarte a dónde tienes que ir, cómo funciona el sistema de profesiones, cómo funcionan los tracks del gear, cómo funcionan, hacia dónde deberías irte para guiar. Creo que yo, más que concentrarme en enseñarle a la gente la rotación, me molestaría o intentaría meter dentro del juego videos en los cuales te pudiera explicar todos los temas que creo que son muchísimo más abrumadores para un jugador nuevo que el hecho de la rotación.
Like the base construct of it, there is a, this will help you learn what you're supposed to do if you are new. And then there is a, hey, I don't want to be the best player at this game. That's totally fine. I play it for a different reason. I want to collect things. I want to like understand the story. I want to quest. I want to level.
Sí, no todo el mundo quiere ser
competitivo.
competitivo.
I don't want to feel
Y
like
está
I
bien.
can go into any
Que cada quien disfrute el juego como quiera.
I feel anxious about that. Like you have the ability to just be like, okay, well at least
Correct.
Blizzard's got me. You know, I can have something at a base level where I can press one button and just kind of hang out and play the game. I have one question about the actual rotational thing. So is that going to like change with talents? So like, let's say, is it going to work off the base talent build, or let's say you select a talent that now moves a AoE button into your single target rotation? Is it going to be smart enough or planned to be smart enough to incorporate a bunch of different potential talent builds?
The goal is that it's aware of your talents, and the logic is conditional based on what you do or don't have talented. As with, this is going to be something that continues to evolve. We may not have every single possible
como el cooldown manager que salió como las bases, pero estoy seguro que el cooldown manager va a mejorar también.
Useful in that form to everyone, and we'll just get refined from there. Similar to the cooldown manager that we know is like, that is a first take at this. We have plans to add much more customization, much more functionality to that over time as well.
El cooldown manager me parece una excelente
I think it's
idea.
a really exciting feature individually. The thing that's most exciting to me is in the broader context of the cooldown manager, of all these other edit mode changes that have come out. There was a time 5 years ago in WoW where if you were just getting into the game, there was an intimidating list of these are the add-ons that you need. And
eso no es de hace 5 años, eso todavía es actual. O sea, realmente para poder jugar a un nivel competitivo competente, necesitas una lista de add-ons sí o sí, inclusive con el cooldown manager.
If you're not using these, you're kind of worse, right? Like you're noticeably worse. If you can't track your group member's major cooldown, right?
Correcto.
Like, you're worse at Mythic Plus than somebody who is, right?
Correct.
And it seems like the goal that has been accomplished with a lot of these things that have been coming into the base UI is you can use those add-ons if you want, but we now have a native way to the game.
Correct.
That you don't have to get an add-on.
That is pretty much exactly our long-term philosophical goal here, right? Like, add-ons are amazing. The things that the community has done over the last 20 years to allow people to experience different...
Los add-ons han subsanado históricamente todo lo que Blizzard no ha logrado hacer con su interfase. Y créanme, después de haber probado Final Fantasy XIV, que no se permiten add-ons, y ver claramente cosas que podrían ser mucho mejores por todos los años que han desarrollado los add-ons dentro de WoW, en mi opinión, es algo que jamás se debería de banear. Sé que hay muchos creadores de contenido, sé que hay muchas personas que creen que los add-ons al final del día son tóxicos para WoW, pero en mi opinión es parte de lo que hace tan mágico o tan diferente a WoW de los demás MMOs, que si los desarrolladores en Blizzard están fallando en algo, puedes contar en que la comunidad va a decir, ok, yo lo hago. Y lo hacen de una manera tan bien hecha que al final del día, cuando ves una pantalla totalmente diferente a la interfase de Blizzard, todo tiene un sentido, todo tiene una estética, todo se ve bien. Entonces, por mí, yo los add-ons siempre voy a estar a favor de los add-ons. Hay limitantes que creo que de repente ya se exceden en algunas cosas, pero en general yo siempre voy a estar a favor de los add-ons.
Aesthetics, different functionality, information available at their fingertips, like that is a huge part of WoW's success, and we don't question or want to undermine that for a moment. At the same time, like as you said, ideally it is about what do you want? How do you prefer to have things presented to you, and not what do you have to do? what is a group mate or raid leader or whatever telling you you must download? Or if you ask people, hey, how can I get better? I'm really struggling at this. The first answer shouldn't be, well, download this add-on, this add-on, and this add-on, otherwise you're doing it wrong. Because that's starting to get into that mandatory place, whether we like it or not. So yeah, I think, longer term, these initiatives kind of fit into part of, how we're thinking about the role of add-ons in WoW. As we can probably all agree, today, there is a sense that if you want to really be the best you can, if you want to play competitive content, there are certain add-ons that are required, that are simply going to improve.
Pero son requeridos si quieres ser el mejor. Eso es algo muy importante que se tiene que hacer la distinción. Porque tú puedes jugar el juego base sin ningún problema si no estás empujando contenido del más alto nivel. Una vez que llegas a ese contenido, cualquier ventaja competitiva que te dé cualquier add-on, obviamente es necesaria porque ya estás hablando del nivel más alto que tienen los jugadores.
Your success over not having them, period. We would like to get away from that being the case. I think I'd love to
Siempre y cuando haya add-ons
see
no van a
WoW
poder
one
hacer eso.
day where you can still customize the aesthetic look of your UI. You can have information and quest helpers and all the other things that you might want to have to make your experience a bit more seamless. But that at the end of the day, when you're in competitive content, when you're queuing up for a rated PvP match, when you're going into a high key, when you're trying to get a first kill on a raid boss, there isn't the sense that you are, just holding yourself back if you're not using specific tools. We know that there's a lot of work to do to get to a place where that could be the reality. The first steps really are going to be continuing to build up the...
¿Sabes cómo? Jálate a los desarrolladores de los mejores add-ons, de los add-ons de los que tú sabes que la gente necesita para poder raidear, y contrátalos para que diseñen las interfaces de Blizzard. Esa es la manera más sencilla de que eso suceda. ¿Va a pasar? Lo dudo mucho. Pero esa es la manera más sencilla.
Just right out of the box functionality that World of Warcraft offers to shrink that gap. But at the same time, I think we're aware that at the very end of this process, we probably are going to have to rein in some of the functionality that add-ons currently have to do like real-time in-combat problem solving specifically, where it's like automating coordination, communication in ways that are always going to be better than anything the UI could natively provide you as long as they remain possible.
Yeah, so that moves us into like raid bosses where I don't want to name any names, but there are people who have optimized a little bit of their own fun out of the game sometimes. I don't know where any of them might be sitting. They could be anywhere. They could be in this room with us.
Yeah.
Hey man, I am the number one. Let's just YOLO this. Let's just do the fight. Let's make it work. And then sometimes it gets to let's try to make something that could be 95% successful, 100 or 99, right? And there's a lot of frustration with the tech involved with that. I would definitely be. I think a lot of the rating community would be pretty for that. I think a well-designed mechanic that the game giving you enough information to solve this on your own realistically. A lot of the times the community.
Con lo que acaba de entrar hace poquito del tema de WoW, de las áreas, cómo ahora están bien marcadas, cómo todo ese tema como que ya es muchísimo más claro, creo que fue un paso excelente para allá. En este tipo de cosas, por ejemplo, en Final Fantasy, los diseños de las mecánicas de todos los jefes, inclusive las más nuevas, los más difíciles, tienen que estar lo suficientemente claras para que sepas lo que te están pidiendo y cómo resolverlo, porque realmente no tienen el tema de Wicadoras, no tienen DBM, no tienen este tipo de cosas. Creo que es una buena idea que el diseño se vaya cambiando o vaya empujando hacia allá. Mientras menos información necesites para poder clearar el contenido de add-ons o de terceros involucrados, mejor. Y creo que lo que sucedió con las marcas bien de las áreas y todo ese tema es un excelente paso hacia allá.
People just use one because it's like what everyone else uses, it gets you in the same place. But if that doesn't exist and the game is giving you that information, it's objectively better, right?
And even if you are doing it very well, manually, it's always going to be better to do it perfectly in a competitive situation. I mean, having watched, your raid leading, for example, over many, many years over the Race to World First, like years ago, you would call much more stuff verbally.
Very
like
true.
Going back to, Legion, BFA era, whereas nowadays it seems like if there is something you're calling repeatedly on attempts, the first thing you're doing is asking if, hey, can we automate this and get me out of the business of talking, which seems like it might be less enjoyable for you as a raid leader.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, if we're talking about that, I could talk all day about that. Yeah. No. I mean, I felt like you certainly had more of an impact when you had the ability to, influence the fight more. But the reality is just getting some way to automate it for your players is just better. You know, it is funny. Like when I
Para
do
eso
that
son los
now,
ubicadores y eso.
I think, you know, what else can I be doing with my time? I could be like looking at other ways to optimize, and it's purely for the sake of getting better. So yeah, for my own enjoyment, yeah, that's sweet. Let's do that. I'm trying to wonder also about those kind of mechanics. So like what bosses have existed in my head, I think in the past couple of years, there's not many, but have been defined by when we're progressing this boss, we feel like maybe we're progressing a weak aura. Something like Brood Twister or Echo of Neltharion or Jailer maybe was one of the first ones, right? And those mechanics, I feel like, could not have been done or probably would have been nerfed without weak auras or having that effectiveness of that reduced. What do you do as a fight designer now? Do you, I know you're obviously like really passionate about raiding, you've raided for a really long time. What do you have to avoid those kind of assignment mechanics? Are there things in game?
Esa es la ventaja y desventaja de no tener add-ons. Si no tienes add-ons, puedes diseñar todas las peleas iguales. Y ahorita tienes que tomar en cuenta que van a poder hacer asignaciones automáticas, etc, etc. Y tienes que también tener eso en cuenta. Eso es un tema bien interesante, la neta.
Use to like naturally sort out those things? Like, do you give more time for the mechanics? Like do you have to stray away from assignments in general because the community has just, whether you like it or not, has like trained themselves to have something solve that for them? Do you have to like go back into like a more simple version of that? Do you find other ways to make fights difficult? There's obviously a bunch of ways to do that.
The way we design encounters has been influenced in significant ways by the way players use add-ons. I know, the community sometimes speculates that, this was built clearly to require an add-on. I can say that's never the case. No encounter designer is ever sitting around saying, all right, we're going to make this mechanic, and then players will write this weak aura to solve it this way. All right, mission accomplished, let's ship the boss. But when we're thinking about the overall pacing of a fight, the
Tienes
tuning,
que tenerlo en cuenta.
Might get feedback on a fight that it feels like there isn't enough going on, when in actuality, there are 4 or 5 mechanics going on, but add-ons are largely compartmentalizing and making it so that most players don't have to think about them most of the time. And then players give us feedback that, hey, this fight felt a little bit slow, like I was just punching the boss for 3 minutes. And so then maybe we add another mechanic in the next iteration of that or a similar encounter. We get to a higher overall complexity space where, there's just, you look at the dungeon journal and you're scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and maybe half of it doesn't even matter because add-ons are going to handle it for you. I think that's not a great place for things to land. It also definitely ties.
Aquí también está el tema que se ha criticado mucho por parte de la comunidad, de algunos creadores de contenido en lo particular, la cantidad de recursos que mete WoW para el contenido del más alto nivel y el porcentaje de jugadores que en realidad están disfrutando ese contenido. Es un porcentaje muy ínfimo, muy pequeño, y al final del día les toma demasiados recursos el estar diseñando las peleas al máximo nivel. A mí en lo particular, como un jugador competitivo, ahorita en retail, pues no, realmente no soy un jugador competitivo, pero pues en Classic sí, ¿no? Vamos a decir. Pero es lo que me gusta. Si yo estuviera jugando retail tiempo completo, realmente yo creo que estaría buscando una hermandad que empujara mítico, estaría buscando una hermandad competitiva. Es como me gusta jugar. Para mí, a mí me gusta, pero también entiendo el argumento de que es una población muy pequeña y son demasiados recursos los que se les asignan para el diseño de esos encuentros.
Their hands in some ways. Like, I think we do fewer coordination mechanics than we used to. Like, there used to be, like, if you look at old school WoW days, there were encounters where, like, the primary challenge for your raid was by design coordinating some rotation. And the execution beyond that wasn't super complicated, but making sure that this thing stayed soaked or that, you were rotating people through with their debuff or whatever, that became a big part of the fight's challenge. Now we know ultimately that that can never be the thing that we lean on for challenge because it's going to be solved, and it's not going to be solved through what we think of as the more just interesting MMOE like communication, cooperation, figuring out systems for having these things work in a way that feels collaborative. It's going to be downloading the weak aura pack, setting it up appropriately, maybe having 3 or 4 frustrating wipes because there was a typo in the configuration, which is that's not what I think anyone really wants raiding to be. And so we move away from making
Ultraacción. Uy, me equivoqué en el nombre de los que tienen que tomar ahorita el grupo. Grupo 3, se salió 1, wipe.
Mechanics
XD.
And lean more on things that add-ons can't solve for you, like moving out of a swirly under your feet with only a little bit of time to respond. I don't think it's a coincidence that more and more of our fights have those sorts of just twitch reaction, avoidance mechanics, whereas that used to be one type of fight that we did. The design space is definitely constrained by the knowledge that, if we lean on it too heavily, it's just going to get trivialized.
Y el problema más grande que tienen ahí, es algo que había comentado hace poco, es que no ha habido una revolución o no ha habido realmente nuevas mecánicas que puedan meter a los MMOs. Es un problema bien grande que tienen. El género está súper estancado y va a haber un cap, va a haber un techo, literalmente, de qué mecánicas pueden meter para hacerlo más y más complicado y más complicado, y el nuevo tier y más complicado, pero al final del día, ¿qué podría ser la cosa nueva? Y ese es el reto que tienen precisamente los que están diseñando estos encuentros.
Some of my favorite WoW raid boss memories are bosses like Mythic Unat, Mythic Anduin. You know, you have to spread out and then you get these marks and you have to go to the right places. And there used to be definitely a library of mechanics like that, where you would get them and then you'd have to think and you'd have to have like a system and you'd have to have 20 players sort of coordinate and become one team that does a mechanic like that. And the fact now that add-ons take on much of that job of coordinating us, I think that almost all the Mythic Raiders I know would be delighted to move back to a world where we did that in our brains, right? But in Dragonflight, we saw a little bit of an attempt to make that happen, right, with the private aura system. And what ended up happening was we still had the weak aura, but now we also have a macro that we need to press, and then the weak aura will assign us the same thing. So I'm a little bit worried. How's the arms race between the weak aura devs trying to come up with a new way around the restriction that you're putting in? Is this just a further escalation in that?
Hopefully not. I think our goal here is kind of disarmament and definitely not further escalation. I think we understand that if we're not going to try more little targeted things like that are going to encourage workarounds, and it just ends up with this back and forth. Because yeah, if there is a way to solve a complex mechanic,
de manera
but you have
más
to jump
fácil,
through a couple of more hoops to do
claro,
so,
lo van a hacer siempre los
you'll do that,
competitivos.
and then just be more annoyed by the
Y
process.
ese es el tema de la comunidad de WoW. Lo hace Liquid porque ellos lo necesitan. Entonces también lo quieren hacer las hermandades que están haciendo heroico, lo quieren hacer las hermandades que están haciendo normal, y en algún momento créanme que si hubiera hermandades que están haciendo LFG, también ellos lo querrían hacer. Es la filosofía de lo que el chango hace, lo que el chango ve, el chango hace.
Process. Our goal is to try to get out of that space entirely.
Claro.
And so I think down the line, eventually, that may mean, I think, some broader restrictions on specifically what information add-ons have access to,
Claro,
about combat events in real time.
Que en todo caso creo que
At the
deberían de
same
quitarlo
time,
todo,
we
pero
know
bueno.
that's not a thing
En
that
ese
we could
sentido nada
just
más.
do right now without providing a lot more on our end, both in terms of
Aparte del combate.
UI-type functionality, but also looking at how we're designing some encounters, how some of our classes work. I think there are tons of add-ons that are healthy and valuable and really important to how players play the game that do rely on that flow of information. Everything from something as simple as damage meters to honestly boss time, like ability timelines, like the DBM style, like when is this next ability going to fire, that people have basically been raiding with forever. That's
Claro.
not the computational weak auras. That's just, hey, this ability is going to happen in 15 seconds. Like, we want to build in our own version of that. I think down the line, we'd love to see a place where there is a boss timeline as just part of the encounter UI. And that's not something you need an add-on for.
En Final Fantasy literalmente te ponen un queue auditivo y Dios te bendiga. ¿Lo entendiste con el queue auditivo? No. O por ejemplo, el jefe levanta la mano izquierda en vez de la derecha. O el jefe hace cierta pose y ahí es cuando viene cierta habilidad. La verdad, en ese sentido, sí es considerablemente más complicado el raideo en Final Fantasy. La ventaja de Final Fantasy es que son 8 personas, no son 20, pero realmente sí se pone mucho más complicado.
And that way we can hopefully eventually get to a point where we're really just cutting out the weak aura that solves the mechanic for you, but not the informational stuff that you feel like, it really feels like the game should have been telling you all along, where
Claro.
add-ons are admittedly, kind of filling in some gaps there.
Okay, so coming in 11.1.7, we're going to have the rotation helper, those two options. What of the rest of this initiative, is any of the rest of this in 11.1.7, or are we just starting the conversation now?
I think there's a lot of stuff that we're working on. I think, we've seen the cooldown manager and then the rotation assist coming. I think down the line, it's some of the stuff that I touched on. I don't have specific patch dates right now, but we are looking at damage meters. We're looking at nameplate improvements. We are looking at, a raid
Damage
encounter
meters de WoW.
information
Órale.
presentation that shows you timeline of boss abilities coming up. Things in that general space. I think we're looking at all the places where players say right now, you need this weak aura, you need this add-on to be competitive,
Para poder raidear, claro.
and asking ourselves, like, how do we change our game to make that not the case? And some of that's going to be add-on functionality, other or UI functionality, other aspects are going to be looking at how we're building some encounters or how some class mechanics work. Like, I think it's super fair to point at some specs, like let's say Outlaw Rogue, who I know are easy one to pick on in some of these ways, and ask like, how is anyone really supposed to execute this perfectly with the base UI? Almost any time we're tracking like stacks of a buff, and you need to make a decision where it's like, if you're between 4 and 7 stacks, you should do this, otherwise don't. Those are not reasonable tests for us to be posing to our players without providing them the information to do it correctly. And so we need to either provide the information, simplify the mechanic, or
cambiar, sí,
There
claro.
are a lot of
cambiar las mecánicas
players who love the version of Outlaw Rogue that it has existed over the past few years. So I think there's always some fear when this discussion starts up of, is the answer going to be to simplify everything? And I think it's really exciting to hear instead that the answer is, okay, we'll maybe simplify some of these huge outliers, but we're going to bring in the functionality that makes it so that instead of needing to download a WeakAura to solve this, right, instead of needing to have a complicated assistant tell you, now you're supposed to press this button, now you're supposed to press this button, instead we're going to provide that information in a more clear way than looking at the top right of your screen to see your buffs and trying to catch the rotation buff between all the other 20 that are changing in combat.
That's definitely the goal. I think we want World of Warcraft to be as approachable as possible, but we also love that the skill ceiling in the game is as incredibly high as it is. That allows for tons of differentiation and self-expression and accomplishment.
Ahí voy a repetir. La habilidad en WoW, al menos de que seas un raider de primero del mundo, realmente es considerablemente más limitada a otros géneros como un shooter. Es muchísimo más complicado. Un RTS como StarCraft es muchísimo más complicado. Inclusive el LoL es un juego mecánicamente mucho más difícil que cualquier versión de WoW, definitivamente. Satanás, muchísimas gracias por el rizazo. Bienvenidos todos. Estamos reaccionando al nuevo video de la filosofía de add-ons para adelante y todo el tema de la funcionalidad que van a meter en el que un solo botón va a hacer toda tu rotación.
But I think, a lot of at its core, a lot of skill in WoW, I think, boils down to multitasking ability. And like even just, you might be able to do amazing damage just testing it against a target dummy. Very different world when you're also in an encounter and need to do 3 mechanics at the same time. And we see, tunnel visioning DPS are a meme for a reason, right? They're just focused on their rotation, and whoops, they just messed up the encounter mechanic, or vice versa. Someone who is good at mechanics, but their DPS goes off a cliff. Really, like the function of a lot of these add-ons is to offload a portion of that computational complexity.
Claro.
And we recognize, like, if we are removing some of that functionality, we're providing more information, we can probably remove a couple of mechanics, but still keep the same level of challenge. The goal is not to make it
Es un reto gigantesco, es lo que estoy diciendo. No sé cómo le van a hacer, nada más.
And I think that's, I think it's a key distinction there, because I think it often can sound like, oh, this is about, this might be about dumbing down the game or simplifying things. It's not that. It's about trying to create a more approachable baseline experience that still has every bit as much room for differentiation.
When you were talking about add-ons that things have been in the game, been inspired by it, you mentioned a damage meter.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm really interested in just what your view is, philosophy-wise, about damage meters in games like this.
That's a great question, and I think ultimately we have to be guided by what our community prefers and what we see them doing today. The single most popular add-on used across the entire game is a damage meter.
Eso es algo que a mí nunca me gustó de Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy no te permite está en contra de los TOS, literalmente tener un add-on que te diga el daño que estás haciendo. Y si lo linkeas en el chat, si le dices a alguien, oye, no estás haciendo nada de daño, bla, 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 te banean así. Y eso a mí me choca, por lo mismo, porque mi naturaleza es ser competitivo y me gusta estar viendo que estoy haciendo la misma cantidad de daño, que estoy haciendo más daño, que estoy aprendiendo, todo ese tipo de cosas. Yo estoy de acuerdo contigo, Sata, ahí. El damage meter a mí no... Si no existiera eso, yo probablemente dejaría de jugar WoW. Si en algún momento prohibieran el uso de ese add-on en lo particular o no lo diera la funcionalidad del juego, yo dejaría de jugar WoW. No me interesa más, la verdad.
Fair margin.
Okay.
The majority of players, the large majority of players, have a damage meter add-on installed. And so that indicates that people want to see that information at least about themselves.
Porque aparte mínimo te dice
definitely want more nuanced
que también vas
measures
tú.
of success and understanding, like, how successful were you or how much did you contribute on this run, highlighting things like interrupts, highlighting things like avoidable damage to get
no
a
lo
fuller
puedes
picture
hacer.
of performance. But
Eso no lo puedes hacer de una manera tan fácil. O sea, decirle a los demás, mi performance fue tan bueno porque interrumpí tantas veces, no me comí tantas mecánicas, es muchísimo más complicado. Por eso se los he dicho, los parses son importantes, pero una persona que te está reclutando para una hermandad, que está revisando tus parses, tiene que tener el ojo no nada más para leer el parse de los daños, sino también que también estás utilizando tus habilidades. Esa es la parte más importante en realidad de un parse. Tener un 99... pero no haces absolutamente nada más que tunelear, probablemente puedes llegar a hacer algo que complique más la mecánica. Nostras, muchísimas gracias por el follow, bienvenido. Puedes llegar a ser alguien que complique más las mecánicas del encuentro, que complique más el clearearlo la primera vez, que una persona que a lo mejor está parseando 50 o 40, pero es más que suficiente para completar el encuentro y está haciendo las mecánicas que no está haciendo. Es súper complicado lo que está diciendo.
At the end of the day, I think for someone who's trying a new spec, trying a new talent build, getting a new trinket, and they want to see like how did this affect my performance compared to the last run, that's an important piece of information to have. And so I think we know that in any world where we were going to limit some of the ability of add-ons to like again do that real-time combat event tracking, we would need to provide a damage meter solution of our own. I think one of the exciting things, I think, if we're doing that on our end, we can also have it be server authoritative, so you're not worried about like who's in a different combat phase, who's out of range, or whatever. It could just be like, this is official and going to be accurate all the time.
We were obviously mostly thinking about Mythic Raid when our brains go to how this is going to affect things, but the overwhelming majority of players are
heroico y normal. Claro, es lo que le estaba diciendo hace rato.
Raids, doing Mythic Plus dungeons, right? When we're talking about making these changes to what WeakAuras can do, is there an appetite for changing how heroic and normal raids function as well? Like, do we see these problems in there as well for what add-ons can do and how they
Yo en lo
solve
particular en este tier no sentí realmente una gran dificultad de heroico. Igual llegué, ya estábamos armados, lo hicimos a la tercera semana con el grupo que lo hice y cleareamos hasta Moxie la primera semana. En la tercera semana cleareamos hasta Moxie, ya no le seguimos porque se acabó el tiempo para los demás, pero fue un tema de un progress como de 3 horas y media y lo cleareamos todo en heroico. Yo en lo particular creo que normal y heroico se sienten bien. Yo no creo que ahí sí necesites como que WeakAuras muy complejos o cosas así. Yo creo que la dificultad de este tier creo que estaría bien tenerla como la base de las dificultades de normal y heroico. Mítico, la verdad no lo jugué, no tengo ni idea, pero normal y heroico se me hizo bien, se me hizo fácil entendible, sin que en algún momento dijera, Dios mío, ¿cómo puedo resolver esto?
I mean, I think it all trickles down, right? I mean, I think maybe even more, a larger percentage of players doing Mythic Raid might use specific WeakAura packs than, let's say, normal. But those add-ons are used by the majority of players right now, and certainly other, boss mods are as well. And I think a lot of it just comes down to, what are the coordination challenges that we're presenting?
Por otro lado, dicen que mientras menos competitivo es el juego, menos tóxico es, pero no compensa a todo lo interesante y apasionado que se vuelve el juego. Mi problema con esa mentalidad, con la mentalidad de que no quiero que sea competitivo, es que no entienden una cosa. Los players son competitivos hasta con Tetris, pues. O sea, hasta con Buscaminas. Cualquier juego de cualquier naturaleza va a invitar a que una parte de la comunidad quiera ser competitiva. El problema es la toxicidad. Y la toxicidad sí se puede lidiar dentro del juego, aunque sea competitivo. Como teniendo mejores sistemas de GMs, teniendo un mejor sistema de poder estar revisando el comportamiento de la gente. No nada más es el hecho de que sea competitivo. Esa retórica que muchos creadores de contenido también tienen, de que la gente vuelve a un juego malo por su competitividad, a mí me molesta, porque yo soy una persona competitiva y yo juego videojuegos porque me gusta ser competitivo. Cuando jugué Marvel Rivals, mi interés fue llegar a diamante, llegué a diamante porque me gusta ser competitivo, y si me quitas a mí esa zanahoria al final del palo, o sea, y me estás enseñando, ya no estoy viendo esa zanahoria, yo literalmente pierdo interés porque no tengo un sistema de competitividad que me llene el deseo que yo tengo. Obviamente no estoy diciendo que no haya toxicidad que se genere por este tipo de cosas, pero yo necesito eso para poder jugar y jugar a gusto. Si no, muy probablemente prefiero jugar un juego single player en el que no voy a estar pensando nada más en ser competitivo. Ok, me voy a poner a jugar solito Grand Theft Auto 5 o me voy a poner a jugar solito algunos otros juegos, pero realmente yo pierdo mucho el interés bien rápido en los juegos que me quitan esa posibilidad.
If there's something that everyone is relying on a tool right now to
Un ejemplo, Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy está prohibido ser competitivo y hay una página que se llama FFLogs que te asigna un número a tu parse y ahí está la competitividad, aunque no hay toxicidad en el juego. No hay toxicidad porque los GMs están bien pendientes de todas las interacciones que hay dentro del juego. Y si te pasas de vivo, te banean así. Ese es un excelente ejemplo. Una comunidad que decide ser competitivo, pero tiene las suficientes medidas de seguridad para que la gente no sea tóxica. Y en caso de que seas tóxico, en Final Fantasy te dicen, mijito, no me importa cuántos años lleves pagando tu cuenta, te me vas a la banca 2 meses, 2 semanas. Y te vuelves a ser tóxico y te banean por completo.
Assist with, we would have to change it to still keep it the same level of challenging, but without that same automation assistance. And that can take many forms. It can be there's 1 or 2 fewer things to soak. You have an extra couple of seconds to actually spread out on the fly. It's a pretty common mechanic of all right, 3 people get a debuff and they just have to run out in different directions from each other. People have been just kind of playing the game and doing those for years and years.
Por 20 años,
but
llevan,
of course,
yeah.
if you can if the time you're given to react is so tight that you can't afford to do that, then people do gravitate towards, all right, we're going to put diamond, circle, and triangle on the ground. Everyone's going to get an auto-assigned marker, and you just know, I'm going to run to my marker to guarantee that it's executed correctly. I think it's a bit more interesting if we give you a couple of seconds so that you can look around and make sure you're not running in the same direction, and then do the exact same thing. I mean, at the end of the day, raiding in particular, but group PvE, group PvP too. In an MMO, a huge portion of, I think, the fun of it is just coordination, communication, feeling like everyone's working together to overcome some challenge in front of them. And I think getting...
Uno de los mejores sentimientos, en mi opinión, es cuando llevas atorado en un jefe, no sé, 2 días y lo matas. Uf, Dios mío. Eso, no, se siente súper bien. El hecho de haber logrado completar ese reto que habían estado batallando por 2, 3 días, 1 semana, y por fin cayó. No, eso creo que es el punto más alto del hype que te puede dar PvE, del sentimiento positivo que te puede dar PvE en un juego como WoW.
Back into a space where there's room for more of that organic collaboration, as opposed to it just being regimented and solved by an external tool. I think will open up a lot of design avenues for the game going forward.
Throughout the last couple years, especially in Mythic Plus, that had been ramping in complexity, you've seen, and actually even if you can go back, you can see the amount of things that people have in their UI to help them know that something's happening. So back in Power Auras, it was, there was just some giant, some giant face on your screen would pop up, and that meant that something procced. And then it's gotten more, refined. And now, even in the last, it's been ramping the past couple of years. You see you listen to someone's POV who's doing High Mythic Plus right now. You're going to hear AoE, dodge, frontal, circle. Yep. It's just every bit of audio aid they've used to it's in the idea of being optimal. It's not required. And especially this patch, I think Mythic Plus complexity has actually gone down as an intentional design point, it seems at least. I think you might have made a post about that. So that stuff is less required, but people have kind of already baked that in the UI. Is that something that you're looking to either have an ability to have that in the game, or is that something you don't want to have happen, where it's more you're organically doing mechanics because you see them, or are you okay with all of the audio and visual aids that exist currently within add-ons?
I think the answer is mixed there. I think audio prompts are something that are super valuable to people. That's something we want to continue to add support for on our end as well. We know feedback we've gotten around the 11.1.5 cooldown manager would be that many people would appreciate being able to have audio prompts tied to certain things, or products firing, and that's something they would miss about weak auras. We want to make sure that we're offering that kind of thing as well. Beyond that, I think a lot of what we've seen is, frankly, us not doing a sufficiently good job of telegraphing the importance of certain mechanics and their impact, and players needing to come up with solutions for them externally. Ideally, there's a concept that we call affordance, which is basically just how well is something telegraphed, how intuitive is it with visual presentation, and ideally, the affordance of a mechanic should match its impact. And sometimes, if you have a random mob in a dungeon pack that has a frontal that will just delete you if you're not getting out of the way of it.
Que eso es la parte de lo que les está diciendo que a mí me pareció muy importante, que en mazmorras como en Midery, como en Hidromilería, ahora los ogros te telegrafean con una línea cuando van a correr hacia enfrente. Para mí eso es excelente diseño, porque no tengo que nada más saber o no solamente estar viendo a logros, sino tiene que estar más que claro que va a ser esa mecánica para que yo pueda reaccionar de la manera correcta, por accesibilidad, por jugabilidad, y creo que es así hacia donde deberían de estar y gravitacionando el diseño de los encuentros en WoW.
Going on among a half dozen other things. Why? And why? Like, how could we call that out better with visuals, with a longer cast time, with how we're creating the pack in the first place? That's just one example of one of the areas in which we know we can do better.
Claro.
And something else we've talked about on the UI front is we would want the ability to, on our end, flag mob casts in Mythic Plus as like lethal, as like this should be a high priority interrupt, because we know players are going to basically look to solve that anyway.
Claro.
If there are 3 casters in a pack, and 2 of them it's actually kind of okay to let them free cast, but one of them, if they ever get a cast off, you're probably going to wipe. They shouldn't all just look indistinguishable on your screen, and us expect you to figure that out on your own.
They did that in season 1, right? Wasn't there like a couple casts or like super giga you die death volley or something?
Yeah.
And they had this big animation.
The Arcara casters where they hunker down, there's green glowy stuff around them, and they're casting a volley, and you're like, all right, I gotta kick that.
You could be playing WoW for 2 days, and you're like,
That's not happening,
that can't happen. Yes.
But I'm looking forward to an M+ then, where if we're talking about maybe taking away my ability to air horn myself on a certain cast, something like that, if instead I have to be now looking at a mob and there is a sort of a visual language that I can come to
Algo que
expect,
brille,
like,
claro.
if the mob is hunkering down and it's got particle effects around it, that means I gotta kick it. I think that would be more fun for everybody as well, rather than having the air horns be the solution.
Definitely.
That is entirely our hope, right? I think, and to be super clear, I think we see the taking away part, the restricting functionality, as the end of this long road. I think we know, we want to make it very clear, we're not sitting here being like, all right, we want you to play the game the way we intended, and we're going to take away your tools. We just want to bridge that gap. And we have a lot of work to do on our end.
Ahí los de Final Fantasy te dicen, yo quiero que juegues el juego como yo quiero. Oye, pero es que no me importa.
Improvements, more functionality, and it's not just the UI. The VFX changes that you mentioned are a part of that overall effort of us asking, what are the places where players feel like they need add-ons to succeed? Why is that the case? And when it's like it's not clear when you're standing in something, and so I need, GTFO or some other sound effect to let me know that I'm standing in something lethal. It should be obvious. Let's fix that on our end.
Claro.
And we know we want to keep chipping away at those things, and hopefully eventually get to a point where really the only difference between what we are offering and what powerful add-ons can do is that small subset of like computational problem-solving stuff, at which point we can move forward.
So throughout the evolution of private auras, we've seen, initially when they came out, they were like kind of, a lot of friction was involved. And then I think they were done really, really well in a couple of cases, starting in Yggdrasil, where they were a mechanic like P1 Fire Act. You had the circles you had to quickly spread out for. They were pretty fast, but they were too fast to use a macro for it. And it basically forced the players into something they would have used a weak aura for, to just do the mechanic normally. And like, are there lessons you've learned there of like, this is actually how we can design mechanics or kind of assignment things going forward? And then also, is this, if done successfully, would this also remove private auras as what would have been, I guess, kind of a temporary solution to...
Es Ion, un creador de contenido de una de las hermandades número 20 del mundo, y el raid leader de Liquid.
The weak aura problem.
Yeah, we've definitely learned a lot from how private auras have rolled out. Certainly we understand that if we're ever using it on something that like is on a long enough time frame that macros are going to let you solve it and it's punishing enough to not solve it, all we're doing is creating an extra annoying hoop to jump through, and we like hotfixed off the private aura designation from some of those back in Yggdrasil, and we've let that shape how and where we use or don't use it going forward. And so yeah, I think examples like the Furak mechanic that you mentioned are ones where like when we know that everyone is on a level playing field, everyone just has to play the game, play the mechanic. We can tune it accordingly so that it's hard but doable. We'd like to be able to do more of that for sure.
Yeah, I see the Firac first intermission, which was a private aura and then had to get hotfixed off of the private aura, as sort of a cautionary tale for if there's a mechanic that is only doable.
El de la izquierda es un raider, dijeron su nombre, es un creador de contenido, yo no lo conozco la verdad, pero es un creador de contenido que raidea en una de las hermandades número 20, creo que dijeron del mundo, que quedó en el tier anterior, y pues él es el raid leader de Liquid. Liquid es de los top 3. Creo que perdió Liquid.
Take away that without giving an adequate replacement, then it's worse than doing nothing at all. what would a mechanic like that look like in a world where we don't have a computational solution to it, right? Would it be
Liquid ganó, no me acuerdo la verdad, perdón.
fewer sets of like lower damage numbers on these things?
I think probably a bit of
Pero
all.
bueno,
There's
top 1,
multiple
2,
nods
3
there.
pues, o sea,
There's,
Liquid
you know,
es top.
on Mythic we might default to like everyone in today's world, everyone in the raid has to participate in this, and you know there's enough things to be soaked that if anyone isn't doing it, it's not going to work out. Versus maybe shifting to a world where there's a little bit more slush, things are a little bit slower, there's a little bit more time to react, to get into place organically based on which, you know, buff you were assigned, stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you know, our goal here is to preserve challenge, and we know that we'd have to design encounters differently in some cases to deliver roughly the same level of challenge in terms of how many pull counts it takes, you know, just what progression looks like while living in a different mechanical world. And I know that, you know, when we talk about restricting any kind of add-on functionality, you know, many players very rightly, kind of reflexively say or ask, well, how am I supposed to do this boss in this tier without my weak aura? That would be impossible.
Claro.
And the reality is, if you couldn't use that weak aura, that mechanic would be designed or tuned differently. We would have ended up nerfing it right away or designing
Mira,
it.
ahí está siendo contradictorio con lo mismo que dijo. A la mitad, un poquito atrás de la entrevista, le preguntaron que si parte de las mecánicas que diseñan, las diseñan con el entendido de que tienes un weak aura o un addon que te va a poder ayudar a resolver la mecánica, y dijo, no, ninguno de nuestros diseños están hechos con eso en mente. Y ahora dice, obviamente, si no tienes ese addon lo hubiéramos diseñado diferente, porque obviamente claro que se diseñan a través, todo se tiene que diseñar a través de los addons que tiene la comunidad y la manera en realidad que van a poder resolverlo, no nada más con qué tan clara es la mecánica.
Differently over the course of even just PTR testing. And so that's like any future design in this space will have to be built from the ground up with that in mind. And I think, you know, it's making it a little bit more forgiving in a way that makes the challenge human rather than superhuman, as it often is when we're looking at like cutting edge mythic tuned things. Because I mean, you guys are really good at the game, as it turns out, and we want to make a boss that is going to, you know, pose a challenge and is going to take you dozens of attempts, let alone 100 plus to beat. We do have to take into account the fact that not just you, but every Mythic Raid guild that's going to follow in your footsteps are going to be using these tools. And at the end of the day, I think players do want challenging bosses. That if, you know, we just tuned the boss around none of those things, players used all those tools, and they went in and like a late Mythic boss was dying in a single night for like, you know, a cutting edge guild, rank 500 or whatever, that probably doesn't match what they're looking to get out of Mythic raiding. In my estimation. And so like our goal is to keep the same overall level of challenge.
Está difícil el reto,
paring down the
neta.
complexity a little bit.
Está difícil el
Even if
reto
you look at the history of
sin
bosses,
quedarse
it's sort of
ellos con
effective.
todos los addons.
You actually, even looking at Mythic Plus, something where the complexity has gone down from pack to pack in this patch, but the reality is you can still find challenge in it because it's infinitely scaling, and there you will get to a point where it's doing too much damage to you, or the amount of damage you need to do is too high. There's been Mythic bosses that have been simple mechanically, but have been unbelievably difficult. And that's been true all the way down the guild ranks. It's not something that's just nerfed by gear. Like Sludge Fist, Kaiveza, where you've created really intricate problems to solve where weak auras basically didn't matter. Halandris, you actually put a bomb timer very clearly in the game around the bomb. You did not need a weak aura for one of the hardest bosses ever, right? It's more just basically the solution for these weak auras has been just a very specific kind of assignment mechanic that is just like, oh, it's just so much easier to do this, right? You could build in a lot of that computational stuff in game to where even if weak auras existed, you would find people just being like, I don't know, the game just kind of does it. We have players that don't use audio sounds in weak aura packs because on bosses like Skarn, on most other bosses, there's like either an in-game sound for when the bombs are actually activating or a voice line. We have 2 players in our guild that use very minimal weak auras, and they literally listen to voice lines for when mechanics are going to happen, and it's extremely accurate.
Y es lo que les
So I
decía
think a lot
de
of these things
Final.
are already built into the baseline game. It's just about choosing like when and how to apply them.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think your example, going back to Nathri of Sludge Fist, I think is a great one, right? Like a lot of that was just practice and just learning like how to react to these situations when chained to different partners and dodging the stuff. And people were in enough situations over enough time. They kind of develop that muscle memory, that sense of planning, and eventually your guild as a whole overcomes the challenge. Compared to, let's say, the Stone Legion generals that came after it, a couple of issues there, but like one of the central challenge, like one of the central mechanics that was being solved by weak auras was like, all right, there's a whole bunch of soaks that need to be covered over the course of the fight, and it's not realistic to have that like 7 to 8 soaks up simultaneously, where you need to also account for like, well, this person just got targeted by different mechanics, so they need a backup to go in and do it for them.
Yeah, so it sounds initially like it's, you know, we're restricting what add-ons can do, but really we're opening up the universe of mechanics that can exist in a WoW boss without, because there are so many that you can think of right now where all of them would be, this is going to get solved by this, right? This is going to get solved by this.
Correct.
If that's not the answer, then now the designers have all these tools back, and we can get these mechanics that maybe haven't been used since MOP because we've been weak auring them ever since, and now we get to solve them with our brains again.
And he even mentioned too, he said like, well, there's a lot of swirlies now.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing, like, oh, we can always default to this and a few other things because you know you're not going to solve that with weak aura, so we can add fights where that's not a thing. But you know, you remove that, you know, that friction of there's too many swirlies goes away. And I think there's assignment, like doing a lot of these assignment bosses without a weak aura that could work would be like really fun. Like it's fun to do that. It's fun when you have 5 people that need to soak something, like the last phase of Gallywix. There's a frontal on a side of a room and 2 people die. And right now weak aura is just like, okay, well then we're gonna assign backup. So these 2 people get a big green thing on their screen, go soak that. That is something where that fight is spread out enough where you could actually communicate that. We need 2 people on the right to back up because 2 soakers are dead. Who can do it? This person says something, this person says something. Now obviously you're not gonna have that kind of communication like heroic and normal. Maybe it won't be in comms, whatever, but in mythic, that's perfectly reasonable, right? A lot of the things, like we could probably count honestly on 1, maybe 2 hands over the last like 4 or 5 years, how many bosses would you meaningfully would have to have a mechanic change, but they are very impactful, very memorable, and they have been purely defined by that. Are you worried at all about the communities, and this has certainly been ramping up over time, like you mentioned, even for us, we were much more just do the mechanic 4 or 5 years ago than we are now. Are you worried that there has been this built-in reliance on it that might be hard to shake when creating new raid bosses?
100% va a haber una lloradera.
And I think that some of that gets back to
Si en algún
us
momento
knowing that we-
deciden reducir la funcionalidad, no sé, del 100% de la player base va a haber una parte ultra vocal en todos lados diciendo que arruinaron el juego, que WoW no se trata de esto, que ellos sí saben, que ellos harían el diseño mejor, bla, 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 bla,
we
bla,
need
bla.
to really ease into this, that any world where we just kind of rip the Band-Aid off and say, all right, have
Yeah,
fun,
honestly,
we're in a new
yeah.
world, as opposed to
Sí, lo tienen que hacer
building
poco a
up
poco.
more built-in functionality.
No,
trying
no,
to
no,
have
sería una
clearer
lloradera
visuals,
por parte de la
simplify
comunidad.
some mechanics.
Nada les parece,
and
nada.
then building counters and to have classes designed around a world where we know that this isn't possible.
Sí, claro.
As long as people are set up for success, I think we'll be fine. Certainly, if we were to disable any
Claro, por
functionality
supuesto que
and
están
then players
quejando.
went into a new tier and like we're just wiping to bosses.
No es
and, like,
diferente a hoy en día, así que qué más da. Yo también creo lo mismo, a mí no me importaría. Si yo estuviera por parte, o sea, por parte de Ion, haría lo que yo quiero y me vale, porque haga lo que haga, va a haber una lloradera de un montón de creadores de contenido, como por ejemplo con lo del rotación. Ya leí un montón de comentarios en Twitter de que no, es que ahora el juego es para tontos y está bien fácil. Y lo más chistoso es que cuando ves a esa gente quejándose, si pudieras revisar sus logs, que yo sé que los logs no dicen todo de un jugador, pero casi siempre estoy seguro que son jugadores que parsean grises. No, es que el juego ya está muy fácil y la madre, y el vato está raideando en LFG. No, es que el juego antes era mucho más difícil y el vato lo están carreando en normal. De que, bro, bájale, o sea, es para todos. Tranquilo, es un videojuego, no tiene que ser ultra competitivo. Del 100% de la población, el 90% no le importa que sea ultra competitivo. Vienen al juego a relajarse, a divertirse. No estés jodiendo, pero así son.
Yeah, they used to clear heroic comfortably, and now they're like brick walled halfway through heroic. Yeah, players like that will be a source of tremendous frustration. But we know that we need to avoid that by any means possible, and we have a lot of work to do before we get there.
Something that really encourages me is the ping system. That seems like such a perfect way to give us an option to
los pings,
identify where we're going, right? You can just ping where you're going.
Algo que me encantaría que existiera en
try and
Classic.
communicate with words. Hey, I'm going to move over to the left
Los
20
pings
yards, right?
fueron,
Just ping
mira.
where I'm going, and that opens
Perfecto.
up an ability to solve these again in a YOLO style, right, rather than an
I
assignment.
think your guild did that.
Yeah.
So the Echo of Neltharion, right?
Yeah,
like,
just pinged it.
Yeah, so
Go for it,
famously,
yeah.
like, everyone had the maps for that. Like, here's your exact spot you go, and then his guild was like, you know what, everyone just ping your spot. Mostly it gets covered, people go to the same spot every pull. But if you see 2 pings in a spot, 1 person has to move, right? And that could largely solve a mechanic with just something that's already built into the game.
Yeah, I think and the ping system is something we've also talked about looking to improve and to like kind of broaden the sorts of things you can do with it to give people more tools to solve these problems in a coordinated way, but using their own skill and expression instead of another tool.
Un week ahora, pues.
When I think of World of Warcraft, I'm always thinking back to
Computarizado
when I
todo.
first started playing the game, and there was this really exciting moment where I looked at it and I'm like, oh my god, I can make this game look however I want, right? Like I can put this here, I can have an add-on that tells me what time it is in London, what time it is in Darnassus, right? I can have all the world clocks there if I want. I can have 3 different bars at the bottom of my screen. I can do whatever I want there, and to me that's always been a strength, not a weakness of WoW.
Yo también. Eso es lo que les dije al
I
principio.
think there's a lot
Para
of people
mí,
that disagree
esto
with
es
me on that.
excelente.
But then there's also people that they hear about Blizzard thinking about restricting add-ons and they're worried about losing that. Is there
Claro.
any intention to go after any of that kind of customization?
Not whatsoever. And in fact, we're doing everything we can
Perfect.
and we would do everything we can down the line to minimize any collateral damage to them. But the goal is anything that's cosmetic should be completely fair game. All informational stuff that's out of combat, like, again, you have RP add-ons, help things that are tracking, helping with professions, tracking gathering
Por eso
nodes,
para
helping
mí la filosofía de algunos creadores de contenido de quita todos los add-ons tan pendejos, tan tontos, punto.
quests, like you name it, a bunch
Ha
of
sido una
accessibility
fortaleza de
add-ons,
WoW los
all
add-ons.
of those, like there's
No una debilidad.
nothing harmful whatsoever about any of them. The only thing is at the very end of the day, once we feel like we've done enough on our end to improve baseline functionality, what we'd be looking at is the ability to parse real-time combat events in a way that drives, problem solving on the fly.
So it's kind of, we build the scaffolding to then be able to take away the
Claro.
existing weak aura solutions
Claro.
that we have for these.
Me parece un reto
How much
súper
of this
difícil, la neta.
is... So the thing that's excited me also about edit mode has been, it's so clearly based on what the community has learned over 20 years, right? It's like,
Correct.
oh, the community has revolved around this as a solution for presenting this information. Let's give them that base in the UI rather than making them download something. How much of this initiative is still going to be based on what the community says, how the community reacts versus which
Debería
of these
ser el
things are already kind
100%.
of locked in decisions?
O sea,
I'd say
siempre
basically
deberían de estar
nothing
escuchando a
here
la
is
comunidad.
locked in.
Correcto. Así
Really,
debe ser.
my hope today is to kind of begin a conversation about that direction and what areas are welcome, what areas maybe have more to do to convince the community on, and what areas we might be wrong on and should, reconsider. Because I think at the end of the day,
Sé que la comunidad
this
es
game
tóxico, pero los tienes que
belongs
escuchar.
first and
Los
foremost
tienes que escuchar
to our
100%.
millions of players. We're trying to
No puedes
serve
ignorarlos.
them as best we can in the long run. And I think our sense is that for many players, the feeling that they have to download and use certain add-ons in order to play the game competitively isn't really part of what's attractive about the game or healthy in the long run.
Es
And
una
so if we
barrera
can pull things
artificial
back
para un
to a
jugador
place
nuevo.
where
Sí lo
add-ons are
entiendo.
available for those who want to use them, but people aren't feeling pressured by their groups, by just the natural demands of competition and not wanting to lose out to someone who's using more advantages, then that's going to be the healthier route in the long run.
So if I was the kind of person who wanted to write a 10-paragraph forum manifesto, this would be one of the topics to do it on, right?
Absolutely. We'll be reading, we'll be listening. I think this is a long path ahead. And yeah, just, curious to kick off the conversation and hear how people feel about it. So Rotation Assist is coming in 11.1.7, which is going to be hitting the PTR in the very near future. Can't wait to hear people's feedback as they're able to hop on and check it out. We'll be listening closely so we can make it the best it can be for everybody. It's also been amazing to just get a chance to talk through kind of the history of add-ons in WoW, where they are today, and where they might be going in the future. Thank you guys for coming out. It's really been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us here. Really looking forward to see what the community has to say about how much they want more of these cats.
Bueno, pues como siempre ya hay obviamente un montón de quejas, pero creo que es un camino necesario para que WoW siga existiendo, para que WoW se siga desarrollando. Es muy importante que limiten la funcionalidad de ciertos add-ons, que realmente trivializan las mecánicas, porque muchos de los encuentros que se están haciendo, si se están haciendo pensando en que tienes que tener un add-on, es una barrera extra una barrera grande extra para los jugadores nuevos que no tienen por qué estar intentando cruzar esa barrera que no está dentro del juego. Pero bueno, vamos a ver qué es lo que sucede con este tema. Me parece un tema interesante. La rotación de un solo botón también me parece bien. Nada más que sí, tiene que tener una penalización muy clara de que no puede ser tan competitivo como estar picando tú tus botones de manera correcta, porque si no, al final del día les quitas a la gente la necesidad de aprender a jugar el juego. Igual creo que para el 50% de la población va a ser una funcionalidad positiva, porque van a mejorar su desempeño, y al final del día, cuando tú estás pugueando, cuando tú estás haciendo contenido con gente que no conoces, lo que quieres es que sean lo más competentes posibles, y creo que para cierto contenido no necesitas que sean un raider top. Entonces creo que es algo al final del día positivo. ¿Qué dificultad en botones o mecánicas de voz? No entendí la pregunta, Valgato. No entendí la pregunta.